testing in this hive. So they have a few laying workers going on. So that means that normally, obviously, it's just the queen who lays eggs. She's the only reproductive female in the colony under normal circumstances. But if the queen dies and she's not there putting out her pheromone actually inhibits workers from developing fully functional ovaries. So without that pheromone to inhibit it, sometimes workers, as a last ditch effort to try and save the genetics of the colony, they will start to lay. But the thing is, workers can only lay unfertilized eggs, which will always be male. They'll always be drones, and that's because workers can't actually mate with drones in order to be able to lay fertilized eggs. So basically, there's no chance of them making a new queen because they can't lay female eggs. So the only thing that we can do with this colony is actually shake it out. So we haven't seen a queen, but what we have seen is a whole bunch of eggs in the cells. So normally there should only be one egg per cell. Sometimes a very new queen will lay a couple when she's, freshly mated and just figuring it out for the first time, but that's definitely not what we're seeing. They're also not just at the bottom of the cells, they're kind of on the sides, they're all over. Multiple eggs in the cells, very haphazard. That's very characteristic of laying workers. We've also seen the actual workers going around sticking their butts in the cells and laying eggs, so we know that we have laying workers. You can't just put a new queen in here because they will kill any new queen that you try and introduce. The only thing to do is to shake out those laying workers, and then the idea is that they won't be allowed into other hives. The workers in other hives will kill them before they are allowed to enter. So there's no solution, you can't requeen, there's nothing to do except shake it out and call it a loss.
So hi everyone, we're in the yard today doing yard inspections. We found this hive here that was queenless, the queen had died. And we also saw quite a few very small emergency cells. So that was our first indicator to take a better look at this hive. Inspecting a little bit further, we found some discolored and dead brood that the bees are uncapping a bit. So we're gonna take a closer look and see what we can find.
This is an example of a brood that doesn't look quite right. It is a larva it is now misshapen. So instead of being the nice white circular larva that you would expect, it's actually more like an elf shoe shape where it's kind of pointing up the wrong way. So if you take a closer look at it, you can see that it doesn't look quite right, and it's another indication that there might be some disease in this hive. And this is an example of a ropiness test, which is an indicator for AFB. I've just used a very small stiff piece of grass, and then I'm going to be kind of mixing up the larva that I suspected was diseased. Asking the bees to move out of the way, and then basically you're looking for a rope almost that comes out from this larva once it's been and the bees are not cooperating right now. They're trying to clean up the mess I'm making, and so that's not ropiness, that's just the kind of this part of the bee. Ooh, ooh. And then so I just pull on it and see if it creates a rope, and it doesn't. And one of the reasons that we check so carefully is for things like American Foulbrood, or the abbreviation being AFB, and that AFB is a reportable disease and is a very serious thing if you do find it in your hive. So if you have doubt, that's why you want to make a very thorough inspection and have a really good look and inform yourself on how to identify AFB.
So we just finished escaping one of our yards here, so you can see all of our towers of supers that we're about to tape up to make sure that all those bees will get out of those supers so we can extract them. But if you look around the yard, you'll notice that we left one super on everything. So we tried to make sure that the super that was left over was one that was mostly empty. And the reason we did that is because we're going to be using a treatment called Formic Pro for Varroa mites. The way Formic works, it's a fumigant, and so the formic acid is going to fumigate off of the Formic Pro pad, And so you need to put an extra box on top. You can't do this in just a single because the bees need to have a little bit of room to kind of move away from the Formic pad. So we've left one super on. The reason we're not putting the Formic pads on today is because of the temperature today. So it is going to be, with the humidity especially, it's going to be about 33 to 35 degrees, which is over kind of the temperature limit for using Formic. So you do need to be careful with Formic, and we do like to reiterate that just because it's an organic treatment does not mean it's a safe treatment. So Formic can be pretty hard on the bees, and there is a temperature range that you want to use it, because if it's too hot, it's basically going to fumigate too much, and it can damage the brood, it can damage the bees, you can get a bunch of queen kills and stuff like that. So we are going to not put the Formic on today, but we will come back tomorrow when it's supposed to be cooler for to put that on. And another thing to keep in mind is that you do need to kind of get an idea of the whole span of time that you're ideally going to leave it on as best as possible. So yes, it's going to be hot today, tomorrow is going to be nicer, but if the next day was going to be hot again, we would probably rethink when we put this on. You really do. You're going to leave the Formic pad in for 2 weeks, so you do need over that 2-week period for the temperature to be below 30 degrees for it to be safe. So it is kind of, this is kind of a little bit of an outlier today, it being pretty hot and humid, so we're pretty good to put it on tomorrow and leave that for 2 weeks. In terms of the actual application of it, we'll show you that later, how to actually put the pads on. It's always good to kind of revisit monitoring, and so just as a kind of the reason for why we chose Formic Pro to treat, remember that your treatment decision should always be based on your monitoring numbers. So we did monitor this yard for Varroa mites, and our Varroa count was below threshold, which doesn't mean that you shouldn't treat it all. It was in the range of maybe 1.5 mites per 100 bees. So below that treatment threshold, which means we have a little bit more options when it comes to treating. We don't necessarily need to use a synthetic strip, but we do definitely want to put a treatment on to knock the mites back. So using something like an organic treatment like formic acid, that's efficacy is a little bit lower than one of the synthetic strips, is a great option when you have slightly lower mite levels like we do. But again, remember, the most important thing is you're making those decisions based on the levels, making an informed decision based on your monitoring.
Today we're actually going to be putting a mite treatment on our hives. We have checked our mite levels, and from that information we've made a decision to use Formic Pro, one of the many fall treatments that we have available to us. So we run singles here at TTP. So one of the things to consider with Formic Pro is that we want a little bit of ventilation. We don't want the bees to be overcome by the Formic. So for singles, go into your hive, and we will be placing an empty honey super on top once we place the Formic on, as well as make sure that you follow all of the health and safety on the label for any of the different treatments. I'm wearing nitrile gloves because they're chemical resistant gloves, as well as I'll be wearing a face mask once I actually apply the Formic. So you want to be placing the Formic underneath the queen excluder, and then we're going to replace the queen excluder and put the empty honey super on top. I like to clear away any burr comb that's on top of the bars of the hive, just so that the queen excluder and the box, everything sits as nicely as it can. So if you had a double or even a story and a half, like a medium and a deep, you would want to be cracking apart the two parts of your hive and putting the Formic Pro in between. But because this is a single, we're going to be adding an empty honey super. So Formic Pro comes in these individual packs. There are 2 pieces. There are instructions that come with each of the treatments. Make sure you're reading them, following the health and safety guidelines, as well as the treatment recommendations. So we have gone for the full dose of 2 pads for 2 weeks. There's also another option of 1 pad for 10 days, followed up with a second pad for another 10 days. It's entirely up to you. Check your mite levels and read some information up on the product to make sure that you're using it appropriately and effectively, checking before and after treatment to make sure that your mite levels are nice and low before the start of winter. It is the fall treatment that we've decided on is the full 2-week 2-pad treatment. So that we basically leave the bees alone for the 2-week period and then come back and check to ensure that our treatment was successful and make sure that everything is still good in the hive before winter.
So you can see that the bees are getting pretty robby. Robbing behavior is a sign that there is no nectar available in the environment for them to forage, so they're going to go and start getting anything they can, trying to rob out other hives, especially weaker hives. So when you are escaping or putting on your your mite treatments, you want to make sure that you are limiting the amount of open hives that you have in a yard, only opening 1 hive at a time, and limiting. We had these empty supers in the back of our truck, and you want to kind of limit how much exposure they have to it. It would have been better if we had placed, a lid on either side of our supers so that they couldn't get in, but we didn't think ahead, we didn't do that. But those are just some best practices to limit the biosecurity risks that come from robbing. We wanted to help connect the dots between all of the different things that we've talked about throughout the past couple of videos and show you a full fall hive inspection to give you a sense of everything that we're looking for at this time of year. So it's still plenty warm during the day to open up your hives and check on them, and it's really important to make sure that you're still doing hive checks and making sure that they are all set up to go into the winter successfully. So as you can see, I have supers on these hives that I need to take off. So they have been left on the hives with a bee escape to give them some time to exit the supers through the bee escape. So now I'm going back and I'm checking to make sure that there aren't too many bees left in the supers, and I'm going to remove those supers and be putting them in the car. You can kind of see in the car I have either a spare bee escape or a spare inner cover that I'm putting the supers down on top of just so that they aren't touching the dirty bottom of the car. For the most part, almost all of the bees have exited the supers, which is great to see. You'll never get 100% of the bees gone. There will always be a couple that are left in the supers. So that's why I brought my bee brush with me, so that I can just brush any remaining bees off, just so that they stay with the hive instead of coming back to the honey house with me. When you're brushing bees, it's best to use more of a flicking motion. That way you don't end up rolling the bees too much like you would if you were actually brushing them off. You just use kind of the edge of the brush and flick them off using the brush. Bees don't particularly like to be brushed, which is fair enough, so it's best to do it as quickly as possible and have lots of smoke at the ready. So now that I have my supers off, I'm going to remove the bee escape. It will still have some bees crawling around inside the maze, so to start with, I'm going to leave it propped up against the side of another colony, just to give those bees some time to exit the maze. There are a lot of bees inside the colony. They're all kind of jammed into the brood chamber, whereas before they had some space in the supers to spread out, so the population didn't look quite as big as this. So because the brood chamber is quite jammed up with bees, I'm going to be using a lot of smoke just to get them out of the way so that they don't get hurt by my hive tool or get crushed by frames or anything like that. So as I'm going through and inspecting this colony, I'm trying to find the queen because I am going to be doing a Varroa monitoring sample using the alcohol wash method. So it's really important that I know where my queen is. But more than that, I really want to make sure that my colonies are queen right going into winter. At this point, it is probably too late for them to be able to rear a new queen themselves if the queen were to die or go missing or anything like that. And it's really important that they have a queen at this time of year so that they have enough of a population of winter bees to be able to survive the long winter. Winter bees are actually physiologically different than summer bees, so they have physical differences that allow them to live longer. They have a longer lifespan, and that's how the colony survives over the winter without that constant turnover of the worker population. It's because winter bees are physiologically different, so it's important that you have a queen at this time of year so that she's able to lay those really important winter bees. At this time of year, if you're finding that your colonies aren't queen right, if you have any queenless colonies, it's important that you combine them with another queen right colony, otherwise they won't be able to survive. As I'm going through, I'm noticing that there are lots of Varroa mites on the backs of bees. That is not surprising or uncommon to see at this time of year, especially because there isn't that much brood in this colony anymore. Brood rearing has slowed down pretty significantly by this time of year. Varroa mites reproduce under brood cappings. So in the fall, when there isn't a lot of brood rearing going on inside the hive, you'll see more Varroa mites on the backs of bees. There should still be some brood in the colony at this time of year, so that's something to keep an eye out for, and especially always checking for eggs to see if the queen is still laying, just to make sure that she is well mated and will be able to start laying again in the spring. Another thing that's important to check at this time of year is the strength of the bee population. So you can see that pretty much every frame in this hive has bees on it, so this colony is definitely really strong. I have no worries about the strength of this colony. Strength at this time of year is really important because a weak colony won't actually be able to take down enough feed. So they won't be able to get enough feed stored up to last them through the winter, and they also just won't be able to regulate the temperature within the hive effectively. So the odds are very high that a weak colony will either starve to death or freeze to death over the winter. A weak colony just won't be able to make it. So if you have any colonies that you're worried about the strength of the population, you should combine those with another colony. So I just got stung in the leg. When you get stung, a really good tip is to spray the area that you got stung with smoke. The smoke will help to overpower the alarm pheromone that was released when the bee stung you. So smoking a sting can help to prevent repeat stings where other bees smell that alarm pheromone, you've been tagged with it, and they'll come and sting you as well. So I finally found my queen, and I put her in a cage so that she's nice and safe. If you aren't comfortable caging her, then you can put the frame that she's on to the side in a spare brood box or something like that, just so that you know she's safe. What I'm going to do next is do some Varroa monitoring. So I'm going to take a Varroa sample using the alcohol wash method. I had done some Varroa monitoring earlier in the year, so around August, and my numbers were looking good. So I chose to leave my honey supers on and get that fall flow because I knew that my Varroa numbers weren't so bad. But now I just want to double check to see where I am at right now in kind of mid to late September, and then I'm going to be basing my treatment approach on the Varroa numbers that I get. We have a lot of videos already available on how to do Varroa monitoring, so I'm not going to go into that very deeply for this video, but be sure to check those out if you need more guidance on how to actually conduct your Varroa monitoring. So you can see I definitely have some mites there. I found 10 mites that first time. I'm just opening it up to check inside of the shaker to make sure there's no mites kicking around there. Just double counting to make sure I have everything correct. And I like to just shake it again, give it another swirl, another tornado, just to see that I didn't miss a whole bunch of mites or anything like that. So I'm shaking it again, and I ended up finding 11 mites on the second shake, so that is a pretty consistent number. First time I got 10, second time I got 11, so that gives me a good sense of where my mite levels are at. Okay, so I've done my Varroa sample, so that was my last thing that I needed to do here today. So my Varroa sample has indicated that I definitely do want to get a treatment on, so I'm going to do a Formic Pro treatment. I don't have the treatment with me today, so I'm going to come back in the next couple days. I'm going to make sure I get that on as soon as possible. In the fall, it's really important to feed, and we're going to talk about that a whole lot in our next Beeyard Sessions video, but we aren't quite prepared to do that yet, and we still do have some time, so stay tuned for that. And now I'm just going to put this bad boy back together. So we always want to make sure that we put the frames in the same order that they came out in. I know that this looks like a bit of a mess right now because we're trying to find the queen with a pretty big population all crammed into the supers into the brood chamber because we just took the supers off. So I did end up taking a bunch of frames out, but I have a good handle on what went where. And also the most important thing is just making sure that actually all the brood frames stay together and honey frames go on the outside. A lot of these frames are honey frames because brood rearing has slowed down quite a bit. If I have kind of a big clump of bees like that, I tend to just shake them off so I don't squish them when I put them in. Box is not actually the straightest, so it's a little bit more challenging to work in, but that's okay. make sure that we release the queen last. Just get all these ladies off here. This is a very deep inner cover, and they filled it with burr comb, which isn't ideal, but there's some honey in there, so I'm not going to scrape it down yet. I'm just going to let them have it because it's a bit of a difficult time in the season, so no sense in taking honey away from them right now. And there's so many bees, I'm just going to try and wiggle them out of the way. It's not flat enough to actually wiggle. They're not wanting to move, so I'm just gonna loop them out of the way with my hive tool. They are getting Robbie right now. There are a whole lot of bees in this box, so sometimes in some ways it can be a little bit more difficult doing this kind of thing in the fall, but it is still really important for the health of your colonies to still be doing inspections into the fall, still staying on top of your mite monitoring and all of that. So just because it's a little trickier right now doesn't mean that you don't have to do it.